What happens when a rising political star, known for her fierce debates and unflinching confidence, suddenly lets her guard down on national television? What if the most powerful moment in a politician's career isn't a victory speech or a viral takedown, but a raw, unscripted confession that leaves the entire country silent? Tonight, we're about to witness a side of Jasmine Crockett that no one, supporters or critics, ever expected to see. This is the story of the night Jasmine Crockett's emotional confession on live TV changed everything we thought we knew about her, and maybe about what it means to lead in America. The stage was set for another routine interview. The network had promoted it as a special conversation with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a chance to discuss her latest legislative battles and her vision for the future. The studio lights were bright, the cameras ready, and the host, one of the most respected names in political journalism, was prepared with a stack of tough questions. But no one, not even the producers, could have predicted what would unfold in the next hour. Jasmine Crockett entered the studio with her usual poise. She wore a navy blue suit, her hair perfectly styled, her expression calm but focused. For months, she had been at the center of Washington's fiercest debates, earning both admiration and scorn for her willingness to challenge the status quo. Her supporters saw her as a truth-teller, a fighter for justice. Her critics called her divisive, even reckless. But on this night, all those labels would fall away. The interview began as expected. The host asked about the latest headlines, bipartisan gridlock, the upcoming midterms, the future of the Democratic Party. Crockett answered with her trademark directness, refusing to dodge the hard questions. She spoke about policy, about the need for courage and leadership, about the importance of listening to the people who feel left behind. The conversation was sharp, intelligent, and, for the first 20 minutes, entirely predictable. But then, the host shifted gears. "Congresswoman," he said, "you've become one of the most talked about figures in American politics. But there's a side of you that most people never see. Tonight, I want to ask you, not as a politician, but as a person, who is Jasmine Crockett really? What's the story behind the headlines?" For a moment, Crockett hesitated. The studio fell silent. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the flicker of emotion that crossed her face. She took a deep breath, glanced down at her hands, and then looked up, her eyes shining with something unmistakable: vulnerability. "I've spent my whole life fighting," she began, her voice softer than usual. "Fighting for my family, for my community, for people who never had a voice. But the truth is, I didn't always believe I belonged here. I didn't always think I was enough." The host leaned in, sensing the shift. "What do you mean?" Crockett paused, searching for the right words. "I grew up in a neighborhood where hope was in short supply. My mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. My father, he was in and out of our lives, struggling with his own demons. There were nights when I went to bed hungry, mornings when I wondered if I'd ever make it out. I saw things no child should ever see: violence, addiction, desperation. And for a long time I thought that was all there was for me." The confession was raw, unfiltered. The host, usually quick to interject, let the silence linger. Crockett continued, her voice trembling but steady. "I remember the first time I walked into a courtroom as a young lawyer. I was terrified. I thought everyone could see right through me, that they knew I didn't come from money, that I didn't have the right connections. But I also knew that the people I was fighting for, my clients, my neighbors, my friends, they needed someone who understood what it meant to struggle. Someone who wouldn't give up on them." As she spoke, the audience watching at home could feel the weight of her words. This wasn't the polished, soundbite-ready Jasmine Crockett they'd seen on the news. This was a woman laying bare the scars of her past, inviting the country to see her not as a symbol, but as a human being. The host, visibly moved, asked, "Was there ever a moment when you thought about giving up?" Crockett nodded. "More times than I can count. There were days when the pressure felt unbearable, when the hate mail, the threats, the constant criticism made me want to walk away. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered the people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. My mother, who never let me forget where I came from. My teachers, who saw something in me I couldn't see in myself. And the kids in my old neighborhood who still look at me and think, if she can do it, maybe I can too." The confession was more than just a personal story. It was a challenge to everyone watching. A reminder that leadership isn't about perfection, but about perseverance. That the most powerful voices are often the ones that have been silenced the longest. As the interview drew to a close, the host asked one final question. If you could go back and talk to your younger self, what would you say? Crockett smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. I'd tell her not to be afraid. I'd tell her that her story matters. That her pain isn't a weakness, it's her strength. And that one day, she'll stand in front of the world and tell the truth, no matter how hard it is. The impact of Jasmine Crockett's confession was immediate and electric. Within minutes of the broadcast, social media erupted. Clips of her trembling voice and tearful eyes were shared across every platform, accompanied by messages of support, admiration, and, for some, a newfound understanding. Hashtags like Jasmine Speaks and Truth on TV began trending, as people from all walks of life weighed in on what they had just witnessed. For many, it was the first time they'd seen a politician drop the mask and speak from a place of real, lived experience. News outlets scrambled to cover the story. The morning after, every major network replayed the interview, dissecting Crockett's words and debating their significance. Some commentators praised her vulnerability, calling it a breath of fresh air in a political world dominated by spin and calculation. Others questioned whether her confession was a calculated move, a way to humanize herself ahead of a tough election cycle. But even the skeptics had to admit, the moment felt real and it resonated. In Washington, the reaction was more complicated. Allies within the Democratic Party rallied around Crockett, praising her courage and authenticity. This is what leadership looks like, tweeted one prominent senator. Jasmine Crockett just reminded us all why we fight. But not everyone was so supportive. Some party strategists worried that Crockett's openness would be seen as weakness, ammunition for her opponents to use against her. Conservative commentators wasted no time, framing her confession as a sign that she was cracking under pressure or unfit for the spotlight. The political knives were out, but Crockett seemed unfazed. Back in her district, the response was deeply personal. Constituents who had followed her journey from the beginning called into local radio shows, sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. At a community center in Dallas, a group of high school students watched the interview together, some wiping away tears as Crockett spoke about her childhood. She's one of us, one student said. She gets it. She's been through what we've been through. For many, Crockett's confession wasn't just a revelation. It was a validation of their own experiences. But the confession also sparked a broader conversation about what it means to lead in America today. For decades, politicians have been taught to hide their flaws, to project an image of strength and certainty at all times. Vulnerability was seen as a liability, a crack in the armor that could be exploited by rivals. Crockett's decision to break that mold challenged those assumptions, forcing the country to reconsider what kind of leaders it really wants. In the days that followed, Crockett was inundated with interview requests, invitations to speak at events, and messages from people who saw themselves in her story. She accepted some, declined others, but always returned to the same theme: honesty. If we want people to trust us, she said in a follow-up interview, we have to be willing to trust them with our truth. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts. Her words struck a chord, not just with voters, but with other politicians as well. Quietly, some of her colleagues began to open up about their own struggles: childhood poverty, family trauma, battles with addiction or mental health. The ripple effect was undeniable. For the first time in years, it felt like the walls between politicians and the people they serve were coming down, if only a little. Of course, the backlash was never far behind. Attack ads began to surface, twisting Crockett's words and painting her as unstable or unfit for office. Anonymous sources leaked stories about her past, hoping to turn her vulnerability into a weapon. But Crockett refused to retreat. In a speech on the House floor, she addressed the attacks head-on. I will not apologize for my story, she declared. I will not hide my scars, because every scar is a lesson, and every lesson is a reason to keep fighting. The moment was met with a standing ovation from her supporters, and even some of her critics were forced to acknowledge her resolve. For Crockett, The confession was never about politics. It was about truth. And in a world where truth is often the first casualty, that made all the difference. As the weeks passed, the story of Jasmine Crockett's emotional confession continued to reverberate. Editorials were written, podcasts recorded, and think pieces published, all grappling with the same question. Had American politics reached a turning point? Was it possible that vulnerability rather than bravado could become the new standard for leadership? For Crockett, the answer was clear. In every interview, every speech, every conversation with a constituent, she returned to the same message. We are all more than our worst moments. We are all more than the stories others tell about us. And if I can stand here and tell my truth, maybe someone else will find the courage to do the same. As the national conversation swirled, Jasmine Crockett's confession began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just a moment on television. It was a movement. People from all walks of life, from big cities to small towns, started sharing their own stories online, using the hashtag #MyTruthMatters. Veterans wrote about their struggles with PTSD. Single parents talked about the nights they went without so their kids could eat. Teachers, nurses, and factory workers posted about the obstacles they'd overcome, inspired by Crockett's willingness to speak openly about her past. The effect was contagious. Local news stations picked up the stories, highlighting the wave of honesty and vulnerability sweeping the country. Community groups organized truth circles, inviting neighbors to gather and share their experiences without judgment. For a brief moment, it felt as if the country was united not by politics, but by the simple act of telling the truth. Crockett, meanwhile, found herself at the center of a whirlwind. Her office was flooded with letters and emails, some supportive, some critical, but all deeply personal. She read as many as she could, often late into the night, moved by the courage of strangers who trusted her with their pain. In public, she remained composed, but those closest to her saw the toll it took. The weight of so many stories, so much hope and heartbreak, was heavy. But Crockett refused to let it break her. Instead, she used it as fuel. In her next public appearance, a town hall in her district, Crockett addressed the crowd with a new sense of purpose. "I didn't come to Washington to be a symbol," she said. "I came here to be a servant. And if my story helps even one person find their voice, then every risk, every attack, every sleepless night is worth it." The audience responded with a standing ovation, many wiping away tears. But the impact of her confession wasn't limited to her supporters. Even some of her political opponents began to see her in a new light. One Republican congressman, known for his sharp criticism of Crockett, approached her after a committee hearing. "I don't agree with you on much," he admitted, "but I respect what you did. It takes guts to be that honest." The exchange was brief, but it marked a subtle shift, a reminder that beneath the partisan battles, there was still room for respect. Nationally, the conversation about vulnerability in leadership continued to grow. Editorial boards debated whether Crockett's approach would become a blueprint for future candidates. Some argued that her confession was a one-time phenomenon, unlikely to be repeated by others afraid of political fallout. But others saw it as the beginning of a new era, one in which authenticity, not just ambition, would define the next generation of leaders. Crockett's confession also forced the media to confront its own role in shaping public perception. For years, journalists had focused on scandals, gaffes, and gotcha moments, often at the expense of deeper, more meaningful stories. Now, faced with a politician willing to be vulnerable on her own terms, some reporters began to rethink their approach. Long-form interviews replaced sound bites. Profiles delved into the personal histories of lawmakers, exploring the experiences that shaped their worldviews. The result was a richer, more nuanced understanding of the people who governed the country. Of course, not everyone welcomed the change. Some critics accused Crockett of playing the victim, using her past as a shield against legitimate criticism. Attack ads continued to air, painting her as too emotional or unfit for tough decisions. But the attacks seemed to lose their sting. For every negative ad, there were dozens of messages from ordinary Americans who saw themselves in Crockett's story and felt empowered to share their own. As the next election cycle approached, the stakes grew higher. Would Crockett's vulnerability help or hurt her at the ballot box?
Would voters reward her honesty, or would they revert to the old standard of stoic, unflappable leadership?
The answer, as always, would depend on the people. But one thing was certain: Jasmine Crockett had changed the rules. She had shown that it was possible to lead with both strength and sensitivity, to fight for justice without hiding from pain. And in doing so, she had inspired a movement that was bigger than any one person, a movement rooted in the belief that truth, no matter how difficult, is always worth telling. As Election Day drew near, the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's emotional confession still lingered in the air. Her campaign rallies felt different now, less like political theater, more like community gatherings. People came not just to hear her policy proposals, but to share their own stories, to thank her for giving them permission to be honest about their struggles. The line between leader and listener blurred, and Crockett embraced it, often stepping off the stage to hug supporters, to listen, to simply be present. The media, too, had shifted. Instead of focusing solely on polls and predictions, journalists began to ask deeper questions. What does it mean to lead with vulnerability? Can a politician's pain become a source of power? Crockett's story became a case study in authenticity, cited by pundits and professors alike as evidence that the old rules of politics were changing. Even her opponents, while still critical of her policies, found it harder to attack her character. The country had seen her heart, and that was something no negative ad could erase. In the final debate before the election, Crockett was asked once again about her confession. The moderator, referencing the viral interview, wondered if she had any regrets about being so open. Crockett didn't hesitate. "No regrets," she said, her voice steady. "I believe the only way we move forward as a country is by telling the truth, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. My story isn't unique. It's the story of millions of Americans who get up every day and keep going, no matter what life throws at them. If I can stand here and be honest, maybe it gives someone else the courage to do the same." The audience erupted in applause, and for a moment, the usual divisions of party and ideology seemed to fade. Crockett's confession had become more than a campaign moment. It was a cultural touchstone, a reminder that leadership is about more than sound bites and slogans. It's about showing up, scars and all, and inviting others to do the same. When the results finally came in, it was clear that something extraordinary had happened. Crockett didn't just win re-election. She won with a margin that stunned even her most optimistic supporters. Analysts credited her victory not just to her policies, but to her willingness to be real, to connect, to lead with both strength and vulnerability. In her victory speech, Crockett stood before a sea of supporters, her voice filled with gratitude and hope. "We did this together," she said. "Not because we were perfect, but because we were honest. Because we believed that our stories matter. And because we refused to let fear or shame keep us silent. This is just the beginning. Let's keep telling the truth. Let's keep fighting for each other. And let's show the world what's possible when we lead with our hearts."